It is the middle of the night in a garden outside Jerusalem, and the most important arrest in human history is happening in the dark, lit only by torches and the cold edge of Roman swords. Judas has just kissed the cheek of the man he is betraying. The disciples are scattering, and in the middle of all of it, a mob of soldiers grabs hold of someone, not Jesus, not one of the 12, but a total stranger. He is wearing nothing but a linen sheet wrapped around his body. The guards get a fistful of that sheet, and he simply lets it go. He runs off into the darkness completely naked, and he is never named, never explained, and never mentioned again. Stop and feel how strange that actually is. Mark is the shortest gospel. He is famous for cutting details, not adding them. He does not waste ink. So, on the single worst night in the history of the world, in the middle of the arrest of the Son of God, why does Mark stop everything to tell us about a stranger who ran away with no clothes on? That question has a stranger answer than you think, and it starts almost 30 years before this book was even written. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what is actually happening in Jerusalem that week. It is Passover. The city has swollen from its normal population to something several times larger, pilgrims sleeping in courtyards, in borrowed rooms, anywhere they can find space. Rome always reinforced its garrison in Jerusalem during Passover, moving extra soldiers into the Antonia Fortress overlooking the temple courts. Because Rome knew this was the 1 week a year when a religious crowd could tip into a political uprising. The temple leadership had their own armed guard as well, stationed for exactly this kind of unrest. And in Gethsemane that night, John's Gospel tells us both of these forces are combined into a single detachment, a Roman cohort alongside temple officers sent out in the dark, carrying torches, swords, and clubs, all of it aimed at arresting one unarmed rabbi. This is not a quiet arrest. This is overwhelming force. Now, hold that image and go back roughly 30 years further to the earliest layer of evidence we have about who actually wrote this book. A man named Papias, writing in the early 2nd century, tells us that the Gospel of Mark was built on the preaching of the Apostle Peter, that Mark served as Peter's translator and scribe, writing down what he remembered accurately, even if not always in strict order. That testimony is preserved for us by the church historian Eusebius, writing generations later. It tells us Mark had access to Peter's own eyewitness memory of these events. But there is a second thread of evidence, and this one comes from inside the New Testament itself. The book of Acts tells us that after Peter is later freed from prison by an angel, he goes directly to one specific house, the house belonging to the mother of John Mark, a house large enough that it had become a regular gathering place for the earliest believers in Jerusalem. A house that large, owned by a family with that kind of standing, sitting in Jerusalem during the very years these events took place, has led many historians and scholars, going back centuries, to wonder something quite specific. What if that same house is the location of the Last Supper itself? What if the upper room, where Jesus ate that final meal with his disciples, belonged to Mark's own family? If that is true, then something remarkable falls into place. Ancient writers occasionally did something modern readers do not expect. They wrote themselves anonymously into the background of their own accounts. If John Mark was a teenager sleeping in his own family's house that night, woken suddenly by torchlight and the sound of an armed crowd moving through the streets outside, it is entirely plausible that he grabbed the nearest linen sheet, wrapped it around himself, and followed the mob out of pure dread and curiosity to see where they were taking the man he had just watched share a meal with his closest friends. We cannot prove this. No verse says his name. But it would explain something that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years, why an anonymous detail this small, this specific, and this humiliating survived in the text at all. Some memories only get preserved in writing because the person writing them lived them. And if that is who this young man was, then the detail is not filler. It is the author, decades later, quietly signing his own name into the darkest night of his life without ever telling us so directly. But that mystery is only the doorway, because when you follow this same young man through the original Greek text, you find something Mark almost certainly built on purpose. Mark 14, verse 51 to 52. And a young man followed him, with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. 2 words in that sentence carry far more weight than an English reader would ever notice. The first word is Neaniskos, translated young man. It sounds like a throwaway description, the kind of word any writer might use in passing. But here is what should stop you cold. Mark only uses this exact word twice in his entire gospel. Twice, in a book that covers the arrest, trial, crucifixion, and empty tomb of Jesus Christ. That is not an accident of vocabulary. That is restraint. Mark had other, more common words available for young man, and he does not reach for them. He reaches for this one, and only uses it in these 2 specific moments. The second word is Sindon, the linen cloth this young man is wearing. This is not just any fabric. In 1st century usage, Sindon describes a particular kind of fine linen, the kind wealthy families could afford, the kind used for burial garments. It is not sleepwear in the way we think of it. It is expensive, and it is closely associated in Jewish and Greco-Roman culture with the wrapping of a corpse. Sit with that for a second. The young man in the garden is wrapped, essentially, in a burial cloth, and he loses it. He is stripped of it entirely, and he runs into the night with nothing. This is not casual conjecture about vocabulary. BDAG, the standard Greek-English lexicon scholars use to establish exact word usage across ancient literature, confirms both of these details. Neaniskos consistently refers to a young man, typically a teenager or young adult, not a child and not yet a mature man. Sindon appears elsewhere in ancient literature, specifically in burial contexts, wrapping bodies for the tomb. Mark did not need to be this precise. A gospel writer working quickly, under persecution, with limited resources, could have used vaguer language and lost nothing of the story. Instead, he chose 2 rare, loaded words and used each of them exactly twice. This exact young man has puzzled serious scholars for decades, not just casual readers. The literary critic Frank Kermode, in his landmark study of Mark's Gospel titled The Genesis of Secrecy, treats this figure as one of the text's central unresolved riddles, a detail placed deliberately just outside the reader's full understanding. When a scholar of that caliber spends real pages wrestling with one anonymous young man in a bedsheet, that is a strong signal you are not looking at a throwaway detail. There is something else worth pausing on here, something a modern reader easily misses. In the honor and shame culture of the 1st century Mediterranean world, public nakedness was not simply embarrassing. It was one of the deepest humiliations a person could experience. To be exposed, stripped in public, was to lose social standing entirely. This young man is not just cold and scared. He has just experienced total public shame, and he leaves the burial cloth behind to escape it. 2 rare words, used exactly twice each. Keep that number in your mind as we move into the second scene, because what happens next is not coincidence, it is architecture. Before we get to where this thread leads, it is worth saying plainly that a video like this takes real hours of digging through ancient sources, Greek lexicons, and church history just to get a few minutes of script right. If that kind of depth is what you came here for, the most useful thing you can do is simply subscribe to Deep Bible Explained. Now, back to the garden. Fast forward through the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion. 3 days pass, and we arrive at an empty tomb early on Sunday morning. A group of women walk in, expecting to find a corpse to anoint. Instead, Mark tells us this: "And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed." There it is, Neaniskos, the exact same rare word Mark used only one other time in his entire gospel, the word he used for the young man who fled naked in the garden. Out of every gospel writer, Mark is the only one who chooses this specific word here. Matthew calls this figure an angel. Luke describes 2 men in dazzling clothing. John does not mention a young man at all. Only Mark, uses Neaniskos, and he uses it in precisely the two places you would need him to if he were building something deliberate. But look closer at what this second young man is wearing. Not a Sindon, a burial cloth, but a stole, a long white robe. In the Greek Old Testament, this exact word describes priestly garments and robes of honor. This is not burial clothing. This is clothing of victory. Now go back one more scene, to the moment Jesus himself is taken down from the cross. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. The word Mark uses for that burial cloth is Sindon, the exact same rare word for the exact same rare fabric the first young man lost in the garden. Jesus is wrapped in the very kind of cloth that terrified young man dropped and ran from. Do you see the shape this makes? In the garden, in the darkness, a young man is stripped of his Sindon and flees in shame. At the cross, Jesus is wrapped in a Sindon and laid in a tomb. At the tomb, in the light, a young man, the same rare word, is seated calmly, no longer fleeing, wearing not a burial cloth, but a stole, a robe of honor. This is a chiasm, a mirrored literary structure ancient writers used to point directly at the center of their meaning. The shame of the garden and the glory of the tomb are connected by one thread, and that thread runs directly through the cross. Mark did not stumble into this. He built it, word by word, on purpose. Now bring this all the way forward, out of the ancient world, into a living room in Ohio, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. Dolores is 68 years old. She has been a widow for 11 months. For 41 years, her identity was built entirely around one word: wife. She was Walter's wife. She was the woman who kept his coffee exactly the way he liked it, who sat next to him at church for 4 decades, who introduced herself at every gathering as half of a whole. When people asked how she was doing, they meant how the two of them were doing, because for 41 years there was no answer that did not include him. Now Walter is gone, and Dolores sits in a quiet house that still has his reading chair by the window, his coat still hanging by the back door because she cannot bring herself to move it. She still automatically buys 2 coffee mugs when she goes to the store before remembering again that there is only one of her now. And here is what almost no one tells you about grief this deep. It does not just take the person you loved. It takes the version of yourself that only existed next to them. Dolores does not just miss Walter. She does not entirely know who Dolores is anymore, apart from him. People from her church have been kind, in the way people usually are for the first few weeks. They brought casseroles. They sent cards with verses on them, the same 3 or 4 verses everyone reaches for, and after a while the visits slowed down, the way they always do. Because grief this long does not fit neatly into anyone else's calendar. Dolores has started to wonder, quietly, guiltily, whether 41 years of showing up, serving, giving, believing, actually prepared her for this kind of darkness at all. She followed every rule. She did everything right. And she still ended up here, stripped of the one thing she built her whole life around, standing in the dark, not entirely sure who she is. That is the exact shape of what happened in that garden. The young man was not simply cold. He lost the one covering he had, and he was left exposed, running through the dark with nothing familiar left to hold on to, no longer sure of his own identity in that moment of total loss. If that is where you are right now, and grief has stripped away not just someone you loved, but the version of yourself that existed beside them, please hear this clearly. That naked, exposed, disoriented moment in the garden was never the end of Mark's story. It was the middle of it. The same gospel that shows you a young man running away in shame also shows you, 2 chapters later, a young man sitting calmly in the light, no longer fleeing, wearing something new. Grief did not get the last word in that garden, and it does not get the last word in Dolores' living room either. no matter how much it currently feels that way. Here is what the garden and the empty tomb, taken together, are actually saying to Dolores and to anyone else standing in that same kind of exposed, disoriented dark. Jesus did not stay safely covered that night. He let himself be stripped, exposed, humiliated in front of a crowd, wrapped in nothing but a borrowed burial cloth, laid in a tomb that was not even his own. Every kind of exposure that young man ran from in terror, Jesus walked into on purpose. He did not avoid that shame. He absorbed it completely. And that is exactly why the second young man in the story is not running anymore. He is seated, he is calm, he is dressed, not in a burial cloth, but in a robe of honor. Because on the other side of that tomb, shame does not get the final say, resurrection does. What Jesus wore into that darkness, exposure, loss, the stripping away of everything familiar, is precisely what he exchanges for something new when he walks back out of it. This is not a promise that Dolores gets Walter back. It is something both smaller and far larger than that. It is a promise that the version of herself she feels she lost in that garden of grief is not gone for good. The same God who took a young man from naked and fleeing to clothed and steady in the span of 2 chapters is still in the business of reclothing people who feel like they have lost themselves entirely. Grief will still be grief tomorrow morning. The coat will probably still hang by that back door for a while yet, but the shape of this story is not a straight line into darkness. It bends, deliberately, on purpose, from a young man running in shame toward a young man seated in glory, and that bend has a name. It is called resurrection, and it was never only about an empty tomb 2,000 years ago. It is about what God is still willing to do with everyone who feels like they ran out of that garden with nothing left to wear. And if that frightened teenager really was Mark himself, then there is one more layer worth sitting with. Decades later, as an old man, writing down the story of that night, he chose to include his own worst moment, unnamed, unexplained, humiliating, and he let it stand permanently inside the story of the resurrection. He did not edit himself out. He let his own shame become part of the evidence that shame does not have the final word. If that is true, this gospel is not just a theological argument about mirrored Greek words. It is one man's own quiet testimony that he, too, once ran away naked in the dark and still ended up on the other side of it. Every one of these videos means weeks spent in commentaries, lexicons, and historical sources before a single word gets recorded. If that is worth something to you, the most meaningful thing you can do right now is subscribe to Deep Bible Explained. And I will see you in the next one.